Recording in progress. Okay, it's exactly 8 o'clock, and I would like us to get started. Well, thank you, friends, for coming together. This is our very special experience on Saturdays, and we have left behind many a meaningful Saturday. We have made some progress, I believe, and today, as announced, we will look at the circumstances, especially focusing on the unique aspects of the circumstances of Jesus' birth. But as usual, I will introduce a general concept because I believe these general concepts are extremely important in developing an appropriate perspective on the teachings of Jesus Christ, as well as remaining vigilant about what could go wrong and what has perhaps gone wrong in dealing with it. So, the idea that I want to introduce today is somewhat like this. And there's an idea that I derived from uh, the great physicist. Um, what's his name? This is the problem in growing old. I'll recollect the name. Um, Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein. Now, Albert Einstein said that one of the great dangers, particularly acute in the modern age, is that the ends are at danger of being overwhelmed by the means. The ends are at danger of being overwhelmed by the means. Or to put it slightly differently, and I'll put it exactly in the words of Albert Einstein, he said, the modern man focuses on the means to the neglect of the ends. You see, what is this aimed at? What is this meant for? What is the purpose? The purpose ceases to matter, and the procedure, the process, the instruments, the means alone become important. Okay? He says this happens to all aspects of human endeavor in history. Okay? For example, the state. The state was envisaged as a medium or an instrument to promote human welfare. But over the centuries, its character changed so that by the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, people began to say that we create the state to oppress us. And I'm quoting from Sigmund Freud. We create the state to oppress us. Matthew is in the field of education. Education has certain very clear-cut, noble goals, but education is practiced very often to the neglect of those goals. Dr. Zach is from the field of medicine. There is a world of difference between what is envisaged under the Hippocrates Oath and what happens in the field of medicine. The unethical practices and the endangering of human welfare and so on and so forth, or making treatment inaccessible to the poor because in the name of quality treatment, people go technology intense, cost of treatment increases, the salaries of doctors increase. As a result, the health services, the medical help goes beyond the reach of the common man. And that happens to some extent even in Christian colleges. So there is always this problem of the ends or the purposes being overwhelmed by the means. Now, church, for example, church is only the instrument, but churches have come to think of themselves as the ends in themselves. There is nothing to point to beyond itself, right? The church is meant to be only a signpost, not the final resting place. But every denomination actually believes that this is the final end of a believer's journey, right? So this is a problem. This is a problem that we need to be mindful about. Why it is so? It is so because this affects the way we read and interpret the teachings of Jesus Christ. What happens is when the the instrument becomes more important than the purpose, then the teachings of Jesus Christ are either not interpreted adequately or are deliberately misinterpreted to justify that inversion of priorities. See, there are two ways of interpreting the teachings of Jesus Christ. One is to justify in reverse, in retrospect, where we have reached. So you pick and choose texts from the Bible, especially from the teachings of Jesus Christ, and say that this is what the church is, and therefore this is what believers owe to the church. There is another way of reading the church, and that is reading the scriptures. That is to read them in order to remind ourselves of what we were meant to be, and therefore to make us realize the course corrections that are required from time to time. These are completely different approaches. So I thought I would flag this issue as a prefatory statement because this affects even the way we look at and celebrate Christmas. Now, for most people, what is Christmas? It would be interesting to do a sample survey of understandings and opinions about Christmas. What does Christmas mean to you? Ask, say, 20 people around. And uh, this sort of confusion prevails not because the confusion is rooted in the scriptures, but because this confusion is created for whatever reasons. So now let us uh, uh, begin to look at the Christmas story, the nativity story, the story of the birth of Jesus Christ, right? Now, birth and death. Now, by the way, in my notes sent earlier to you, I had suggested two readings from two Gospels, Gospel of Matthew and Gospel of Luke. As you know, Mark and John are not particularly rich on. John, of course, doesn't even talk about it. Mark is very brief. We don't get any help from either of them. So it's only from the Gospel of Matthew and Gospel of Luke that we have some account of the birth and the circumstances pertaining to it of Jesus Christ. So I'm assuming that all of you are familiar with those textual details. So I'm not going to read those references, nor am I going to take up those texts and analyze them verse by verse, because that's not the kind of work that is required to be done with people like you. You're all mature people, and I will not treat you as any less. So let's. My aim today, my aim today is to try and see if your experience of the coming Christmas, beginning with the Advent season, could be different from what it was before. So I have a very clear cut goal. What is that? To see if our experience of the coming Christmas season and the Christmas event can be different from what it was, say, in the past years and decades. So that is my rather ambitious goal. I'm going to flag that as the kind of point of reference. With that, let us proceed. Now, the first thing I want to say is that birth and death are both mysteries. Birth and death are both mysteries. No matter how much science progresses, certainly death, and I would say even birth, will still retain its aura of mystery. And it is my understanding that wherever mystery prevails, there is the presence of God. I'm very deeply convinced about it. Why? Because mystery passeth human understanding. There is a difference between mystery and suspense. As all of us know, Albert Hitchcock was the master in suspense, right? Now, suspense is created by withholding relevant information. Mystery has nothing to do with how much you know. No matter how much you know, mystery will remain. Suspense will be dissipated with the availability of relevant information. Mystery will remain mystery irrespective of how much knowledge you accumulate. This is the main reason I'm saying that wherever there is mystery, there is the presence of God. My second argument is that wherever there is the presence of God, there is a purpose. So I always connect presence with purpose. No presence, if you and I are self respecting people, our presence should not be meaningless, purposeless, casual, irrelevant. Okay? If we take ourselves seriously, we have a duty to make sure that our presence is relevant. Our presence is purposive. And this is the reason why I have been emphasizing in the last 3 months that we have been together the need for us to grow and develop in a holistic manner, because our relevance is directly proportionate to our growth. If we develop and grow in a multifaceted manner, then our range of relevance increases. If we don't grow and stay stunted and shriveled, then not only that our relevance does not expand, but that our relevance actually shrinks. That results in futility, frustration, and even self-revulsion. And I say this because this is a predicament of many people. Many, of course, do not say this in public. They may not even admit it in private circles, but I'm sure that millions of people are living with this avoidable burden, the burden of self-revulsion. How did it happen? It happened because we neglected our most fundamental duty to develop ourselves as the special kind of creation that we are envisaged to be. And in our understanding, on our effort to understand Christmas today, I'll be putting the focus consistently on this aspect because I believe that this is extremely crucial. So, a couple of things I've introduced, that is, birth, death are mysteries. Wherever there are mysteries, there is the presence of God. And where there is presence, there is a purpose. And therefore, if you have a spiritual outlook on life, you should be continually mindful of the purpose underlying your birth. Now, if you look at the circumstances of the birth of Jesus Christ, the entire nativity narrative, it is absolutely clear beyond any doubt that all those circumstances announce together one thing, and that is there is a special purpose that underlies the birth of Jesus. Of that, there can be no doubt. This is not a casual birth. This is not just an accident. This is not some kind of sensationalism which leads to nowhere. There is an overwhelming purpose at work within this narrative, giving it a sense of direction, relevance, and dynamism. That's the first thing I want to emphasize. Now, in this context, I'm reminded of the words of St. Augustine, who said that each time a baby is born, God is reaffirming his faith in life. Each time a baby is born, doesn't matter which baby, maybe baby in a slum, maybe a baby born out of rape, maybe a baby born to mentally retarded parents, doesn't matter. Each time, and that's just because St. Augustine puts it in comprehensive terms. He says, each time a baby is born, God is reaffirming his faith in life. That's a kind of significance, respect, and reverence with which we must approach every birth, and all the more so the birth of Jesus Christ. So, through birth, the birth of every human being, including all of us, through birth, God introduces something unprecedented, something that never existed before, and something that will never come back again. Unmatched, unprecedented, and unrepeatable. These are the words that St. Augustine uses. Unmatched, unprecedented, unrepeatable. Each birth has three characteristics: it is unprecedented, it is unique, it is unmatched, and it is unrepeatable. Okay? And that's the kind of significance that we ought to ascribe to our own birth, any birth for that matter. So, um, now let's look at, having looked at the significance of birth. Of course, there is a great deal more to be said on it, but let's move on. Now, a word about Mary, the mother of Jesus. And when I think of Mary, the mother of Jesus, and particularly in the context of the nativity narrative, what comes uppermost in my mind is the awesome choice she makes. The daring, bold, unimaginably courageous, and non-stereotypical, unorthodox choice she makes. I want to emphasize the word unorthodox because there are people who are willing to fight and die for orthodoxy, not understanding what orthodoxy is. I've been saying in the context of Kerala in the last 5 years in particular, that people who are zealous about orthodoxy must understand orthodoxy. Okay, now there would have been no Christian orthodoxy but for the unorthodoxy of Mary. You think of an unwed woman becoming pregnant today in the 21st century. Assuredly, the outcome would be a medical termination of pregnancy. Assuredly. This is what? 2000 years ago, where in Jury land, where these mores were rigorously imposed, she could have been stoned to death, but for the very special response and choice on the part of Joseph, Mary would have been stoned to death. That was the punishment at that time. Okay, so now through Mary, there are many things we can learn from Mary, but let's look at most basic things now. We must encounter or realize for ourselves the supreme and shaping importance of choice. I believe that following Jesus Christ must be a personal choice. That's why I'm not particularly convinced that infant baptism is a good thing, as a helpful thing. I know this is, I'll stir a hornet's nest if I talk more about it, so I'm going to leave it. Because the experience of making a personal choice is diluted and in many cases obscured, eclipsed in the process. People may say, oh, well, infant baptism is followed in many traditions with confirmation, etc. But it's not quite the same. Let that be. Now, two things. One, human personality is nothing but the sum and substance of the choices we make. So, in a real sense, we are making ourselves all the time. And we must take that process seriously. I want to emphasize this, my friends, with all the force at my command, because this is what my fellow Christians refuse to understand. Both through our omissions and commissions, we are making and unmaking ourselves all the time. For example, if you face a situation of injustice, unfairness, inhumanity, your conscience will certainly urge you to respond. But if you, in order to save your skin, pull back and, like the priest in the Samaritan story, look the other way and go, then that affects your personality. And by personality, I mean also your whole capacity to understand and the degree of your aliveness, your personal vitality. The more we retreat from our responsibilities, which is, these are all personal choices, nobody is imposing that on you. The more you retreat from personal choices, the more you're caricaturing yourself. God has given us the right to lead a vital life, an impactful life, right? Why is it that that is not realized by a majority of people? And I believe that this is largely because people do not understand the spirituality of choice. With each choice that we make, choice either to do or not to do, the choice to be or not to be, as Shakespeare's Hamlet says, to be or not to be, that's a question. Yes, that's a question. So, for whatever reasons, if we relinquish the spiritual freedom given to us to choose the path of righteousness, right? As Jesus says, you read it in the 6th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, verse 36. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you, right? Psalm 23, verse 3. He leads me along paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Okay? These are all choices. I mean, Jesus will lead you, God will lead you, but you have to choose to go. Nobody will be dragged against his or her will and led along the path of righteousness. So, from Mary, think of this amazing thing. Let me borrow a few words from T.S. Eliot. He talks about that awful moment of self-surrender. That awful moment of self-surrender. That is the great thing about Mary. You can't think. You see, the Catholics, of course, revere Mary, Mary Literary, and I have no problem with it. Let me say this to you, I have no problem with it, provided you understand the principle of Mary, which is the principle of making daring choices, not because one is reckless, but because, or let me say, unorthodox choices, radical choices, because one wants to be in alignment with the will of God. You understand? That is an important aspect of the Christmas story, without which there would have been no Christmas event. If I were to really look at the seed of Christmas, it is actually the courageous, unorthodox, radical choice made by this innocent village girl. She could have been not more than, say, 17, 18, 19 at that time, right? It's an amazing thing. I mean, the more I reflect and meditate on it, the more amazed I become. So, and that, of course, that choice, and this is important, that choice leads to what the church recites. It's called the Magnificat. That's the Song of Mary. Do you think there would have been this most amazing song by Mary without that courageous choice? Now people want Mary's songs without Mary's choice. And there are, of course, preachers and evangelists who are willing to sell such stuff. Okay. You don't have to go through Mary's problems, but you can get Mary's song. And this is where things have really collapsed. So, if you read Mary's song, and today I'm not going to analyze Mary's song, time will not permit it, but I only want to underline the revolutionary nature of her song, her perceptions, her understanding, and her sudden insight into history. She's very historical in what she says. Okay. And if you recall the session last Saturday, and as Dr. Laji pointed out quite rightly at that time, and I'm very grateful that he did, it's amazing. It's already there. Okay. So the importance of choice. And complementary to this in the nativity narrative is the role of Joseph. Joseph is not any less really. It's not easy for the male ego to accept what Joseph decided to accept. And the Bible says he was a righteous man. And because he was a righteous man, he decided to put her away quietly. He didn't want her to be exposed to extreme cruelty. So he had that modicum of justice in his outlook. So, and after he is encountered by the angel Gabriel, Joseph also transcends the deeply entrenched social mores and norms, the standards, the stereotypes. And this is actually true moral heroism. True moral heroism. Now, we think, why do I emphasize this? Because over the decades and centuries, an impression has been created that mindless, slavish conformity is the ultimate Christian virtue. Fall in line, then you are a faithful man. That's not what the Bible is telling us. You look at anything which is significant, you find that it is very, very different. In fact, contrary to this assumption. So, we must remember the role of Joseph. Joseph also makes a choice. And through that choice, he enters the salvific history, the history of the salvation of humankind. Salvific, adjective of salvation, salvific history. Okay, now let's quickly look at some of the most striking features of the nativity narrative. Each one of the things that I'm going to say, about 9 or 10 of them, is important enough to be taken up as separate studies. But I'm not going to do that. I'll just flag this for your own personal individual initiative and research. The first thing I want to emphasize is the striking absence of the markers and trappings of religion in from the nativity narrative. You read the story of the birth of Jesus and tell me what is religious about it. On the other hand, religious elements are conspicuously absent from the nativity narrative. We are so used to celebrating Christmas within the religious paraphernalia, therefore, we think that it was a religious event. If you are truthful to the textual narrative recorded in the two Gospels that I've referred to, you will necessarily come to the conclusion that is a completely a religious event. There are no associations with the traditional trappings of religion. There are connections, of course. I mean, we can discuss it later. For example, there is no presence of any priest. There is no presence of any liturgy. There is really no presence of any religious symbol. There is no presence of any tradition, doctrine, dogma. No functionary, no symbol. What are the most important symbols of the nativity story? The manger. What is religious about the manger? What is manger? It's a trough in which food for animals is kept. The other prominent symbol is the star. What is religious about the star? Right? Where is religion in all this? Do you see a single priest anywhere? There were priests at that time. There was a high priest. The entire Sanhedrin was there. But you don't see any of them. You see shepherds. You see the Gentiles, the Magi, the wise men from the east were Gentiles. They were not Jews.
Hello.
So pay attention to
Hello.
this. If you want
Hello.
to be,
Yes.
hello,
Yeah, I'm
anyone want?
speaking. Yes.
Yes, Zach, you want to say something?
Okay.
Zach, Zach, you want to say something? Can you hear me, Zach?
I'm in the middle of a meeting. And can you call
Okay,
me in
fine,
the
fine.
evening?
Yeah,
Okay.
fine, fine.
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
done,
Okay.
done.
Thank you.
Okay. So the second point I want to emphasize is that the birth of Jesus signals a radically new beginning. Now, let me say a few words about this because it's very important. Now, the most important signal here is from the Gospel of Luke. I think it was chapter 2, verse 7. There was no room in the inn for the birth of Jesus, for Mary, right? There was no room in the inn. Now, let me ask you a question. Is it a sad thing or a glad thing that there was no room in the inn? We are very sentimental about it, right? Oh, Mary did not have any room in the inn at the time of her travail. But if I think of the inn, I would be offended if Jesus were born in the inn. But what does the inn stand for? It stands for profitable transactions, which is accommodated within culture, right? That's what the inn stands for. It is purely profitable transaction. You think a new beginning can come from that orbit? Absolutely not. See, you remember in one of the sessions I discussed this whole pattern of people assuming that something new will come out of the old pattern. It's like expecting that a new song will come from the old gramophone record. Okay, you play the gramophone record again and again, you will get a new song. Does it happen? This old groove will produce the same old song. So it's a good thing, in my opinion, that there was no room in the inn. The tragedy with most of us is that there is plenty of room in the inn. And maybe this inn stands for our churches. Who knows? Plenty of room. Okay. So part of our problem, my dear friends, is on account of our belongingness. Sometimes, of course, every human being longs to belong, but sometimes belonging can be a real problem. Our belongingness can constitute an invisible prison, and it prevents us from venturing out and encountering what we really need to. And this is the reason why in European culture, especially when the European culture was at its most dynamic stage, there was a great emphasis on venturing out. And there is a technical word for it. It is wanderlust. Wanderlust. That is the great eagerness to wander, to go to unfamiliar areas. In fact, that's how colonialism started. Seafaring, adventurism, going to unknown places, discovering new lands, new people. Of course, it had this ugly underbelly of creating colonialism. But the positive side of it was dynamism, but the dynamism was applied to the wrong motive, and therefore you have the enslaving of the alien people by European nations. So it's important for us to realize that new beginnings can come only from outside the stereotypical model systems and structures. As long as we stay confined to the old and the familiar, the dogmatic and the closed, we will stay in the same groove. Nothing new will ever come into our life. We will live and die saying the same thing. And this has happened to all of us. I realized this, for example, I realized this in my academic life. After teaching for about 30 years in St. Stephen's College, I really got jaded and I left the college. I went into activism, completely unstructured life, a life of uncertainties, no guarantee, no security, no nothing. And I tell you, that is the greatest experience in my life. I began to understand things very differently. So life has taught me that so long as we stay confined to familiar patterns and systems and structures, we will lead a jaded, lackluster, unprofitable, fruitless, barren life. It's a reality. I am not convinced, my friends, that that is God's will for us. I'm not suggesting that everyone has to strike out and leave from where you are. That's not what I'm saying. Stay where you are, but keep your minds open to new possibilities. Look beyond the familiar, the given, the jaded, and realize that there are infinite possibilities in this most wonderful world God has created, of which we know precious little. How much of our life do we explore and understand? How much of our personal potential do we realize and apply and develop? To what extent do we know ourselves? Who are we? Do we have an answer to this? And no matter how long you live on this earth, you may still leave this earth knowing nothing about yourself, not having realized any of your potential, because you've been trained to stay in the same groove all the time. And that is considered faithfulness. And I believe that that is exactly the opposite of faithfulness. Faithfulness to what? You understand, you examine the biblical definition of faith and apply that understanding to this phenomenon, then you will realize. And I have in mind to do a separate session on faith. What is faith? Much later, not today, but in one of the subsequent sessions. So um, the uh, the idea of a new beginning, is that possible in our life? Jesus says, "I've come to cause a new beginning in your life," isn't it? Right? When Jesus said to Nicodemus, it's recorded in the third chapter of John's Gospel, that he needs to be born again. What does he mean? He means that a new beginning needs to be made, isn't it? Or is it new beginning like the old beginning? What are we talking about? When Paul says in the second letter to Corinthians, chapter 5, verse 17, he who is in Christ Jesus is a new creation. The old has passed away. What does he mean? One thing is very clear. If anyone has encountered God, there always was a dramatic change. Look at all the encounters of people with Jesus recorded in the four Gospels. This is invariably the outcome. There's a radical change, there is a new beginning. It is that beginning that is also stamped upon the birth of Jesus. That's why there was no room in the inn. So, this is not something to be sentimental about, it's something to celebrate. It is something to be acknowledged as a challenge, to have no room in the inn. Sometimes it's the greatest of blessings that there is no room in the inn for us. And we must really rejoice and thank God that there is no room in the inn. You remember at the early stage, a member of this group who is now not with the group said, "Oh, I feel very sorry for you, Acha. You are all alone. You know, everybody has deserted you." Uh, Honest to God, I rejoice because this is precisely my calling. right? I am not here to repeat jaded stuff. I'm not here to recycle what is already known and repeated a thousand times. Okay, God leads me along very, very difficult paths, forces me to make difficult options. Through it all, I've been shaped in a particular manner. I'm not apologetic about it. Even if everybody runs away from me, I'll still rejoice, so long as I remain faithful to it and not buckle under pressure. So, this is a second important point. First was the importance of choice. Second is the importance of a radical new beginning, which is the birthright of every human being, which you may or may not exercise. That's your choice. There is no compulsion. But the consequences are very, very substantial and sometimes horrendous. Now to the third point. Now, the narrative of the birth of Jesus Christ, they are very scanty, admittedly, very scanty, are full of universal connotations. You cannot but you cannot but uh, look at and realize the universality of the event. Now, of course, the event is taking place in an obscure part of the world's geography, the ancient Near East, Palestine. It's happening in Bethlehem, which is not really very important at that time politically, and it's happening in a in a cattle shed. And yet, if you read the narrative, you will be amazed at the many overtones of universality that enrich the narrative. I'll very quickly mention some of them for your sort of guidance and continued reading. Look at the symbols that are uppermost, most prominent in the nativity narrative. There is a babe. The babe is universal. Every baby is global. It's only when a baby grows within cultures that globality is substituted with the local and the parochial, the babe. Then there is a helplessness of a woman, universal, isn't it? And in Kerala, of course, this is now being talked about, atrocities on women, etc. But even otherwise, all systems in the world have been, in varying ways and to varying degrees, unfair to women and turned a blind eye to the helplessness of women, particularly when it came to political choices and decisions. The third pattern is the pattern, universal pattern is the pattern of displacement. Mary was displaced because of a political decision. That's also very universal. The fourth is vulnerability. Displacement, of course, leads to vulnerability. The fifth, of course, is the mismatch between resources and needs. You see, there are plenty of resources in the inn, but those resources will not match the needs. And that is the problem, a universal problem. See, there is poverty in this world, there is destitution in the world, not because we don't have enough resources. The earth produces enough and more to feed all the people on earth. But there are millions and millions of people who sleep on empty stomachs because resources do not match needs. It's a universal issue. Then, of course, as I said, there is a manger which is universal. Was now not universal at that time, it was. Then there is star which is also universal. Okay. Now, what religion does, all religions do it. What religion does is it takes up the universal and caricatures it and turns it into the local and the parochial. It renounces the universal because, and this is a theme I have developed in my book, Thoughts for Trying Times. And I would suggest that you read the book. The reason why religions reject or say extirpate or exclude the universal element from a spiritual tradition is that the universal element cannot be accommodated within the religious framework. Universality cannot be accepted and accommodated within the framework of any religion. Now, Jesus came preaching the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God is a universal thing. It is not correlated to any geographic area. It is not correlated to any religious tradition. Okay? So when that is reduced to an organized religion, universality goes, and only the local and the particular and the parochial alone become important. And this reductionism distorts the teachings and the spiritual vision of Jesus Christ, against which we all need to be continually vigilant. So the universality is compromised to the interest of the parochial, because only the parochial can be appeased, the parochial can be managed, controlled, manipulated to one's advantage. Now, the fourth important aspect of the gospel, the nativity narrative, I want to point out is the thematic structure. I told you some time back that when, as a student of literature, when I look at any event, I'm particularly concerned about how an event is structured. Structured. What are the structural patterns in a given event? Okay. Now, when I look at the gospel, the nativity narrative, I see in this a conflict between, or the episode is structured on the conflict between two important themes: the theme of power and the theme of love. In the nativity narrative, there is a head on collision between power and love. The birth of the holy babe concretizes or crystallizes the love of God for the world, and the responses of people like Herod crystallizes the present nature, the political nature of the world, which is brutal violence. Right? Now, this is, of course, a very, very complicated theme that I may need to, perhaps we'll have time only to discuss it. Therefore, I'll take a little time on this. Now, though I said it is power, actually, if you look at it, it is violence. What Herod practices is not power, it is violence. Okay? Now, I'm going to explain the difference between the two, and I'm also going to introduce a few other terms so that we can think clearly through this. Now, you remember in one of the previous sessions, I said there are two types of people. One is those who cannot look beyond themselves. And in that context, I talked about the chronological unfairness, the fact that others may enter into the fruits of our labor, just as we have entered the fruits of the labor of those who have preceded us. But this is not something that is universally liked. People who are power crazy do not want anything to survive them. Okay? Now, Herod is a good example. What does he do? Because he couldn't lay hands on the babe, he orders that all the male children below the age of 2 should be massacred. All right? Nothing should survive. And that is the nature of power. Now, I have to say that's the nature of power when it is corrupted. Now, we have to be very, very careful when we discuss these themes, and I'm going to be as careful as I can. Therefore, in order to be clear, let me now make a distinction, and I hope you are with me on this. The distinctions are very important in understanding truth. Now, we must first distinguish between power and violence. Power and violence. Now, power is always derived from the people. Especially in a democracy, it's very obvious. That's why we have elections. A democratic government has power. Even the monarch has power only because of the people. Though monarchs tend to misunderstand the nature of their power, like Louis XIV did, and he said, I am the state. Right? People don't matter. I am the state. That shows an extreme state in the corruption of power. And when power corrupts, it banks entirely on violence. Now, Afghanistan is happening, so all these things will immediately connect. You can continue to reflect on this. I'm sure the distinctions that I offer today will be very useful. Now, Herod, if you look at Herod for a minute, why did Herod become so insecure at the birth of a babe? Because, and by the way, this is something that I understood only quite recently. The insecurity of Herod must be understood with reference to the fact that he did not derive his power from the people, he derived it from Rome, which is always unstable. Okay? Now, when power is separated from the people, it comes under the compulsion to use violence. That is history. What history I know tells me very clearly. Wherever power was separated from its original source, after all, in the social contract theory of the origin of the state, a state comes into being only because the people come and agree that there should be a constituted center of authority. Okay? So when power, which actually originates in originates when people come together and act in concert. Act in concert means act together with one will, agreement, consensus, etc. Power is born, and the ruler exercises power only to the extent that he stays linked to that source and does justice to it. In other words, for a ruler, whether he's a king or a prime minister or an executive president, for a king to exercise, for a ruler to exercise power, he has to do justice to the people. Now, this is so important to understand in our times because there is so little clarity on these matters. That's why I'm going to take a little time. And these things will help you to understand what's happening globally. For example, why did America fail in Afghanistan? Why did America fail in Vietnam? And why did America not learn from its colossal failure, humiliating failure in Vietnam in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, early 70s? By 70, actually, the whole thing ended. And why did America repeat the same mistake and get a bloody nose in Afghanistan? Because it does not understand that power comes from the people. America thinks that power comes like Mao Zedong said. Mao Zedong said, power comes from the barrel of a gun, right? You're familiar with that statement? That's utter folly. Power does not come from the barrel of a gun. Violence comes from the barrel of a gun, not power. This mortal, lethal confusion prevails. That's why I thought I would say a few things about it in order to achieve some clarity of sort. So there is the power of love, and then in contrast to that, there is a love of power. Okay, what Herod embodies is the love of power, and power is loved as an end in itself, and therefore the only language he knows is the language of violence, and therefore the massacre of the innocents is a natural, logical outcome. If you have a ruler of that kind, expect atrocities. It's something that people don't understand in the Indian context today. Many people think that it's a nice thing. Just wait and see what happens. Even Christian leaders don't understand. Mark my words. There are people who are playing with fire, not realizing what they're doing to themselves and particularly to the community and to the country. Okay, let that be. So, in contrast, Jesus embodies the power of love. Okay, now the problem with power is it breeds the psychology of insecurity. Therefore, everybody is a threat to me. That's why, for example, in Indian politics, both under Congress and now under BJP, the main man will not allow anyone who is promising to come up. Mrs. Indira Gandhi was notorious for it. She never allowed anyone with any political acumen to flourish under her leadership. It was very convenient and comfortable for her to have people who did not have any political base, mass base, because they could be easily controlled. And the same thing is being repeated today. And that is why in India, we do not know whether we have a cabinet. And people say that we have a cabinet of 2.5 people. The others don't matter. Okay. So all these patterns can be understood if you're clear about the distinctions that I'm trying to offer. So now, as I said, power comes from the people, or the origin comes from the people. But of course, on a spiritual understanding, power comes from God. But the Bible makes it very clear that God entrusts power to a ruler for the sake of the people. There's no power which is considered healthy in the Bible, which is exercised by the ruler without a reference to the welfare of the people. And that is why, in the case of David's misdemeanor, where he plotted the death of Uriah the Hittite in order to marry his wife Bathsheba, Nathan the prophet comes and points a finger at him and says, "You are the man." And then, the throne of the king shakes with that one statement by the prophet. And then you have Psalm 51, which is the repentance of the king. Okay. Very interesting to study these things. For a moment, David the king lost sight of the meaning of power and he fell into deep atrocities. Okay. So, uh, power is a very special thing. Power is a sacred thing. So I don't agree with this idea that all power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Of course, I agree that power can corrupt, and power can be corrupted. But when power is corrupted, it ceases to be power; it becomes violence, and violence depends largely on instruments, implements, tools. So man's ability in history has been proved largely by the creation of instruments of violence. There's no instrument of power. We would say, for example, that the parliament, the judiciary, the executive, these are the instruments of power. Okay. But instruments of violence are different. Atom bomb and cruise missiles and all kinds of weapons of mass destruction, so on and so forth, right? These are all instruments invented, fabricated by man. God creates power, man creates violence. Okay, that's a distinction. And then there is another word, which is authority. Authority is derived from a system. For example, church leaders have authority. But their authority, and that's where the mistake comes. Most leaders, Christian leaders, think that their authority comes from the constitution of the church, the Sabha. No, their authority must come from God. That's a biblical understanding. And it is when the divine source of one's authority is not respected that such rulers become hirelings in the metaphor that Jesus uses, or wolves in sheep's clothing. Okay. So now there is another word which is also related to this, which is strength. Strength. Strength is always personal. We don't say that the prime minister has strength. No, the individual called Modi has personal strength of character. The prime minister has power. The prime minister may use violence, but the prime minister will have authority only if he does not use violence. By the way, in history, power and authority and violence can never mix. The moment you use violence, you lose authority. If you have authority, you do not have to use violence. It's only a ruler who does not trust his own authority feels tempted to use violence. You understand? All these are happening in our midst. That's the reason why I'm offering these distinctions. So anyway, the episode, nativity episode, the birth of Jesus Christ, is structured on the polarity between power and love. Okay, Jesus is the intrusion or the coming in of God's love into the world, which is now suffocated with the authority of man, the authority, not the authority, sorry, the power of man, which is misunderstood as the right to use violence. By the way, in any political text, political science text, in every political science text, you will read that state alone has the legitimate authority to use violence. The most distinctive feature of the state is that it has the legitimacy to use violence. No other individual, person, group, or people group has the legitimacy to use violence. That's why the Maoist movement is sought to be crushed, etc. Rebellion is put down, armed rebellion is put down, etc. Because it is accepted universally in all political theories that the state alone has the right to use violence. Okay. Now, the state, my point is that the state should not come to a position where it needs to use violence against its own people. The state should function in terms of power, and power originates in people, or from a spiritual point of view, power originates in God for the sake of the people, not for the sake of the ruler. Okay, now you see that pattern beautifully in the nativity narrative. And therefore, it is very interesting to study the birth of Jesus Christ and all the circumstances put together. The role of Herod. Why is Herod there? Herod is an important player in the narrative nativity story. Actually, the contrast, the symbolic contrast is between Herod and the little baby. It's amazing. Huh? The mighty ruler and the powerless, fragile, helpless little baby. Who prevails in the end? Who prevails in the end? The fragile baby prevails. That is a mystery of God. As Napoleon said, the statement is attributed to Napoleon. Napoleon said, Alexander the Great, Charlemagne, and myself built vast empires. But the days of our empires are numbered. But the kingdom of Jesus will never end, because our empires were built with swords. Jesus' empire was built with love. And this is what Napoleon Bonaparte said. Okay. So that I quote this advisedly in order to underline the fact that this contrast is there, pulsating through every tissue of the narrative of the birth of Jesus. I have another 5-6 points more to make on this. Maybe I'll do another session. Uh, Next Saturday is a special lecture by Professor Prabhu Guptara, who is a very distinguished, who was a distinguished academic in Europe. He taught in St. Stephen's College before me, and I joined the Faculty of English against the vacancy created by his departure. He went abroad and did quite well. So I thought we could listen to him. He'll talk about what's wrong with Christian organizations, and I thought something about the practical side of life also could be interesting. So I will now stop here, and we can have a little time discussing whatever questions you have. I'm sure that you have many questions. So there we are, and I hand myself over to you.
Yes, I have a question.
Thank you, Anne. Good.
This is about God's authority.
Yes.
Is there no violence in God's authority, considering that his justice often seems quite violent?
Yes. And now, That's a very, very perceptive question, because certain interventions on the part of God may seem to be the outbreak of violence, right? For example, if we agree that Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed by God, hmm, then was it not violence? Okay. Now, in the pattern of thought that I presented to all of you today, I was trying to give to violence a particular historical interpretation, which is that when power corrupts or power is corrupted, it expresses itself as violence. And then I referred to the fact that violence is expressed through instruments or arms or technology or violence or whatever. Right now, as far as the divine intervention is concerned, now I have to also say this. What I'm now going to say is very controversial. Now, take it for what it is worth. Very often, what is attributed to the will of God may not be, because it's a matter of human interpretation. But let us take on face value the biblical statement, and I take it on face value, that Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed under God's wrath. Right? Now, here the issue is this. Now, human actions have consequences. Now, without that consequential reality, there is no moral world. The moral domain exists because there is a connection between what we do and the consequences our actions provoke. All right? Now, for example, if a city becomes depraved, the city will destroy itself. How many cities have been destroyed in history because of human depravity? So it is possible to understand this at two levels. One is, and this is the interpretation that Baruch Spinoza would offer. Okay, I know this Baruch Spinoza is also very controversial, particularly Zach, and I'm sure Zach is with us now. Zach has observations about Spinoza. Now, Spinoza's point is this. You see, God created a beautiful system. That system has its own natural laws. Now, when Baruch Spinoza says natural laws, he doesn't mean natural laws in the sense in which physicists mean. Now, it's a little complicated. Let me explain. Spinoza says nature has got two aspects. One is natura naturans. Second is natura naturata. Now, this is a Latin phrase. I don't know Latin, but I know the meaning. What it means is natura naturans means the creative power of nature. There is a creative power in nature, right? Natura naturata is what results from the creative power of nature. Okay. Now, whatever is created, that's what we see. But there is an invisible power, and that is natura naturans, that creative principle that was created by God. Okay. So let's leave the Latin rags aside and say that there is a creative principle in nature, and there is the created substance of nature. Nature as a product. The other is nature as a creative principle. Okay, that is the simplest possible explanation I can give. Right. Now, what happens is, when God created the creative vital principle and imbued his own, or infused his own laws into it, that creative principle is not arbitrary, it is not chaotic, it is not just anything. If you interfere with it, there will be consequences. And Spinoza will tell you That consequence need not involve the wrath of God. It's just like in physical life, if you put your finger into fire, your finger burns, right? Okay. Now that's not because God is angry with you. It is it is part of the natural law. That is natural law as in science. It is part of the natural law. It is inevitable in natural law that if you touch fire, your finger will burn. Clear? Okay. That we don't say, oh, my finger burned because God is angry with me. In the same manner, when the creative principle, the inviolable creative spirit of nature is interfered with, something within that is provoked, which expresses itself in terms of massive reactions. Now, very likely, perhaps, this can be useful in understanding or interpreting COVID. I cannot separate the COVID epidemic from the atrocities human beings have been heaping on nature over a long period of time. These microbial creatures have nowhere to live, so they leap from nature to human beings. They're not against any one of us. They are not attacking human beings. They're simply looking for their habitat, a place of residence. And they find very suitable accommodation in human lungs, heart, etc. Okay, and they flourish there. They're not aware of attacking you or killing you. That's not their intention. Their intention is simply to live, and they live according to their nature. Okay, so therefore, now I have to go into these details in order to provide some kind of a tentative answer to Anne's question. So these questions are all very difficult. They are not. There's no simple answer to this. Okay. Now, uh, God doesn't have to practice violence to correct the aberrations of a system, because God has already built into that system the logic or the potency or the power to defend itself. Just as God has imbued each one of us with the power of self defense. You know that in international law, in every code of law, right to self defense is recognized, right? There's no debate about it. Every individual has a right to self defense. If that is true about individual created by God, that's our belief. Life is God's creation. The same thing must also be true about God's creation called the called nature, right? And the same principle will be transferred from nature to culture, because culture is what man creates out of nature. You can't have culture without nature. All objects, all facilities in culture are created out of natural resources. If the earth had no resources, there would have been no culture in the world. Okay. Therefore, even when these things operate in a subtle manner, the power of God, which is already imbued into the creator order, will respond and react in a corrective manner when the system is jeopardized. Okay. Otherwise, the creator must be an unwise and uncaring person. For example, why is it that God has given us two eyes? So that we can avoid dangers, right? Or given two legs, we can run away from danger, isn't it? Or hands, we can defend ourselves to some extent, isn't it? Understanding, so that we can adjust ourselves to the giving. So the basic resources, means for survival, for development, for leading a meaningful life, all this is already invested in us. Okay. Now, we may use it, we may not use it. If you don't use it, then we ourselves will get into serious trouble. And at that time, you can say, God, why have you done it to me? Okay. Everybody says this. Why have you done? Why has this happened to me? Now, the point is, God may not be looking for everybody, whoever is doing some mischief, I will target him. that kind of a crude idea, I can't relate. I believe that God created once and for all the basic principles necessary to sustain life in sanity and in wholeness. I'm not therefore saying that, like the Days said in the 18th century, that God created the world, gave everything into it, and he withdrew. And he is living. And that's what Browning says, God is in heavens and all is well with the world. I don't believe that. God is still engaged with the world. But does God actually do global or cosmic policing? Look for every individual wrongdoer, target him? I doubt it. I believe that we live in a morally organized scheme of things where certain consequences necessarily follow our actions of omission and commission. And therefore, there is a cumulative effect. For example, if a person drinks for 20 years, his liver will be eroded. Now, does God have to do it? No, the principle exists. If you're a chain smoker for 20 years, you will develop bronchial cancer. Does God do it? God doesn't have to do it because that's the logic of life, right? So, this is where I use the principle of divine economy. That is, God doesn't do anything superfluous, right? If he has already made the provisions for it, huh, why intervene all the time? Like anxious, neurotic parents, all the time chaperoning their children, not letting them turn to the left or right. I don't think so. Therefore, this idea of that we attach, the idea of violence that we attach to divine supervision or intervention in the world, I believe needs to be sort of looked at with greater reservation, a greater sense of God's wisdom in creation, right? So that's the sort of tentative answer I offered you. And what we can do is you reflect on this, and if you have further questions, we can discuss. Okay. Okay.
What's the Thampu? Can I ask a question?
Yes, Roy.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier on the danger of belongingness.
Yes.
In that context, the only thing in terms of religions, whatever religion you're faith to belong to, Christian faith, you have extreme cases of Christian believers who have, I think, gone a bit mad. And similarly, the followers of Islam who have equally gone to ISIS. So there is a bit of danger of that getting away from belongingness. So that's, just from what you said. The second one I was going to point out was you mentioned touched very briefly on Afghanistan and the politics of American politics. Some time ago, Franklin Roosevelt said, and that's how I understand the American politics. You look at South America, all the nasty dictators that they control. Roosevelt said something along the lines, he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. Excuse my French, but that's what he said. I was just quoting what he said. There's a bit of danger trying to understand these things in the context.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Yes. Now, your first question about observation about belongingness. Yes. Jesus addresses this issue, and it's important for me to mention. Your raising this issue gives me the opportunity to do so. Why did Jesus say, "Abide in me and I in you"? Let's face it, human beings have a need to belong. There's no question about it. We are not meant to be islands. The book of Genesis, chapter 2, verse 18. It is not good that man be alone. So, belongingness is a fundamental human need. That's point number one. Point number two. At the same time, it can also be a source of great danger depending on where you belong. Okay? If you belong to man made systems, there will always be problems. And that is why Jesus, you see, at that time, as Arnold Toynbee points out in his book, A Historian's Approach to Religion, It's a very, very eminently readable book. He says it's amazing that a religion like Judaism came into being in that region because all over the ancient Near East, there were only polytheistic religions. In the midst of it all, there is one single monotheistic religion. How did that happen? He says history cannot give an explanation for that. This is Toynbee. Now, uh, there was such a religion, there was a religious establishment, there was a priestly hierarchy. It is keeping all of this in his mind that Jesus says, abide in me and I in you. So we need to belong, but we need to be very careful as to where we belong. We must belong to God and God alone. And this is further consolidated in the passion narrative. That's another, the account of Jesus' suffering and death. As Jesus goes to Jerusalem there to be arrested, tried, and crucified, he sends his disciples to the village called Bethany and says, you go and untie a colt there, a donkey there. And there is a qualification for the donkey. This donkey was never ridden by anybody else. That's a qualification. You understand? This donkey did not belong to anybody. I mean, in the sense of operational sense. It may have in terms of ownership belonged to somebody. That's why it is tied somewhere. Otherwise, it would have been let loose. Yes, it belonged to somebody, but nobody has ridden this donkey. Understand? So, when Jesus says in the 8th chapter of John's Gospel that if the Son of Man makes you free, you shall be free indeed. That process of making you free is related to the state that Jesus refers to in the same Gospel, chapter 15, verse 4. Abide in me and I in you. That is freedom. Okay. So if you belong to man-made structures, you will never be free. And this is not what I'm saying. And the first person, the first thinker who alerted me to this is that very, very stimulating Russian philosopher, Christian philosopher, Nikolai Berdyaev. Nikolai Berdyaev. He says that there is no man-made structure in the world which will respect your freedom. He says even the family will constrict your freedom. And maybe he was influenced by what Rousseau said in the 17th century, that man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. Okay, so that chain is actually on account of our belonging. Okay, now for example, we were bachelors, or men and women before their marriage, before their wedding, they were free up to a point, all freedoms that we can think of in this world are relative. The moment you enter into a relationship, your freedom is compromised. Okay? And for better, for worse. For better, for worse, both. All right? So, this is an issue which has got tremendous spiritual significance. And it's because this issue is so crucial that Jesus states it explicitly at the outset of his public ministry. You find it in the 4th chapter of Luke's Gospel, and he reads from the book of Isaiah and says, I've come to set the captives free. Who are these captives? He's not talking about political captives at all. He's talking about religious captivity. Jesus never did anything to liberate people from political captivity. He liberated people from religious captivity, because that's the most fundamental freedom. If that freedom is compromised or abandoned, then political freedom means nothing to you. The most fundamental of all freedoms is religious freedom, but religious freedom is not freedom as it is enshrined in the Constitution of India, Article 25, the freedom to preach, practice, and propagate your religion. It is freedom to abide in God and to be guided and empowered by the will of God, if you believe in it, and I believe in it. I think that's freedom for me. Okay? In God alone is our freedom safe and perfect. Nowhere else. This is why all systems are always nervous. There's no system that I can think of, including systems of religion, that grant freedom of thought and expression to people. I mean, heresy. Why is heresy such a big issue in religions? Because freedom of thought is always considered a grave danger. One particular view has to be imposed down the entire spine of a community. If you believe even slightly off the track, slightly differently, then you're out. And in olden days, you would be burned alive as a heretic. Okay, so that much about freedom. And the other was about, yes, I fully agree with you about the American role in South America and West Asia. Afghanistan is, after all, part of the same geographical belt. You know, everywhere does the same thing. But the surprising thing is they don't learn. They don't learn from experience. Very unfortunate. And what makes me feel embarrassed is that throughout the world, America is known as a Christian country. That's the citadel of Christianity. And that's really the problem from my point of view. Okay, any other? Thank you, Roy. I appreciate this.
I
First
have a
question.
question.
Yes, please. Can I see you?
Yes. Oh, I can see you very well.
Okay, I can't.
Rennie.
Oh, Rennie, yes. I saw you in the beginning, but now somehow something has intervened between you and me. Like in Luke 16, there is a great gulf between you and me. All right, Rennie.
One of the things that I don't understand is, say the British government, it uses the will of God to suppress a foreign independent nation, saying that this is my message or mission. Whether it is for oil, whether it is to divide and rule, there is always the religious heads who come and pray and send an army with guns and machine guns and everything.
Exactly.
And that is something I will never understand.
Yes. Well, let me say, you are absolutely right in saying this. And this is what I call co-opting God into one's own agenda. Rather than seeking the will of God, this is what people do all the time. It's not merely heads of nations and armies, etc. In our own individual life, let me give you a crude story. The story of two pastors, Pentecostal pastors, negotiating the wedding of their son and daughter. And they agreed on everything and they decided on getting them married. So then the pastor said, when the question of dowry came, they said, now let's go into a room, shut the door and pray to God for divine guidance. So they prayed, and the girl's father, the pastor, got the first revelation. He was the quickest to get the revelation. He said, yes, God has spoken to me. And he says, not a rupee should be paid as dowry. Then the other pastor said, God has spoken to me differently. God says, don't accept anything less than 10 lakhs. You see, now, this is actually how we use God all the time. And churches do it, nations do it, societies do it. And there is no war in history which has not begun with prayer or sacrifice. In ancient Greece, before a war could be fought, the king or his deputy had to go to the Delphic oracle and consult the priest. What would the priest do? The priest would sacrifice a bird and then rip open its belly, bring out the entrails, and read the pattern of the entrails and say whether or not the outcome will be victorious or humiliating. So God's will is written on the entrails of the bird. I mean, that's the kind of stupidity to which the most enlightened people of ancient world succumbed. No? And of course, I mean, you don't have to say more about it. All of you are familiar. I can give you instances after instances after instances. It's a very unfortunate state. Every church thinks that it has the monopoly of God's will. Every church does it. I wrote an article some time ago where the Christians are polytheists. We say we believe in one Christ, but how many Christs are there? The Catholic Church is certainly not the CSI Church. The CSI Church is certainly not the Marthoma Church. The Marthoma Church is certainly not the Orthodox Church. And the Orthodox Church is certainly not the Jacobite Church. Right? And it goes on like this. And each church is very sure that God is not free to look beyond its borders. If you say to an Orthodox priest or bishop that God could be in sympathy with the Jacobite people, I mean, your physical safety could be in doubt. This is the reality. And we call it Christianity. And everybody is willing to die for it, I call it a madness. I mean, this is religious madness. Okay, let it be. I mean, it's very unpleasant even to think of it. Any other? Well, actually, my tablet is left only with 5% power. So I may be able to continue with you only for 5 or 10 minutes. Any further question?
May I ask one more question?
Oh, yes, Sam. Yes.
This is with respect to what we were discussing earlier, so about the justice of God. So there are times in both the Old Testament as well as the New Testament where it seems like what happened at that point was not how do I say it? It's not what we would expect naturally. So it's like a sad miracle. Like, for example, with Ananias and Sapphira.
Yes.
So in that case, how does this apply that God created this system which has consequences? Because here it seems like it's outside of those consequences.
Yes. Now, and my main concern in saying whatever I have explained to you before is that I am against using fear as an instrument to promote piety. Because I believe God must be loved rather than feared. Or even when we fear God, it must be fear through love, not fear through fear. Right? Yes. Now, the second, before I come to the Ananias Sapphira episode, again, let me make a reference to Spinoza. By the way, Spinoza was a Jew, and because of his radical views, he was excommunicated by the Jews. Then he became a Catholic. The Catholics excommunicated him because of his philosophical views, and he died alone. He died in poverty. And one of the most stimulating minds Europe ever produced. Now, Spinoza says that when you read the Old Testament, you must keep one thing in mind, and that is that the Jews had a particular way or particular habit of attributing everything to God which in their eyes seemed impressive or surprising. And he makes this comment with particular reference to the Tower of Babel, that God came down to confuse the tower, and the tower collapsed into debris. Right? Okay, so that is now what is the principle here? The principle is that in our understanding certain realities, our own patterns, our own cultural patterns, ethnic patterns interfere. Therefore, our conclusions, no matter how convincing they seem, may not be ultimately valid, and therefore we have to be to a certain extent skeptical of our convictions regarding these things. This is a point that he makes. Take it for what it is worth. All right. Now coming to Ananias Sapphira. Now, this again, what I'm going to say now is not what my original insight. This is what Max Weber in the Sociology of Religion says. He says, look, when Christianity started, first of all, it started as the religion of the poorest of the poor. Secondly, in the first 3 centuries, the early believers lived in a state of eager expectation regarding the imminent second coming of Jesus. He says you cannot understand anything about the early church, early Christian communities, without taking this into account, that they were, what is in technical language, an eschatological community. Eschatology is the theology concerning the end of times. Eschatology. So they were an eschatological community in the sense that they actually believed that the second coming of Jesus Christ will happen in their own lifetime. And the basis for this belief was that Jesus said that there are many standing here who will not die before the Son of God comes again. In what sense he said it and all is a matter of debate. Leave it. Now, therefore, the early Christian community created the first example of communism, that is, holding everything in common, abjuring personal property. Now, Karl Marx makes a difference between private property and personal property. What is private property? Private property results from the extortionist practice of capitalists who exploit workers through surplus value. Surplus value happens when workers are not paid equal to the work that they do. So that money becomes the private wealth, private property of capitalists. That must be distinguished from personal wealth. Now you have, or I have worked for 40 years, have set apart something for the rainy day. That's not private property, it's personal property. Okay. Now, anyway, the early church believed that even personal property should not be retained by individuals. They should renounce personal property, pool everything together, and sustain the life of the commune out of this common resource. So many people were doing it. But Ananias and Sapphira sold their property as others did, but practiced deception. So maybe from Peter's point of view, here is the attempt of the satanic element to penetrate the integrity of the early church or early Christian community. And that's the kind of seriousness that is attached to it. Otherwise, in our times, even people who pay tithes are very rare. Ananias and Sapphira gave 50% and they died for it. So it is not a question. I mean, it is presented certainly, as Anne points out in the 5th chapter of Acts of the Apostles. This episode is presented as the outcome of Peter's anger. There's no doubt about it. But whether it is God's anger kindled against them, whether it is the kind of atmospheric compulsion, pressure, anxiety. You see, the gravity of any act is determined by the context. Now, if you are living in the underworld, telling a lie or cheating 10 people is not a big deal. But if you're living in a monastery, slapping somebody is a big deal. Okay? Like that. So in a community that had an electrifying life of faith, which was impelled by the fiery expectation of the imminent second coming of Jesus, and a community that cherished its integrity above all else, a fiery faith. In that context, this kind of the intrusion of the deceptive is a very serious matter. So I think that episode can also be read also be read as the kind of, shall we say, the terror that seizes the individual when the individual himself realizes. Of course, it is found out. After all, Peter found out not through any informer, but because of his spiritual power. So, if you are in the presence of a spiritual person who can see through your deception and you have practiced that deception, it is not easy to handle that situation.
I think we have gone off the net. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.